from the News Channel 5 network. This is Open Line.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Open Line. Glad you're with us tonight. It is Tuesday night, the 2nd of February 2nd, 2021. And we are talking about something that's been in the news a great deal, this kind of new stance that some business leaders are taking by refusing to give political campaign contributions to Republican lawmakers who voted to overturn the election. Kind of the newfound political stance that some business leaders are taking. What do you think about that? What does that mean? Will they continue it? Is this just a blip, or is this some major change? And so we're going to get into that tonight. We, of course, want to hear from you, but always happy to have our guest. I want to welcome Professor Mark Cohen. He's with Vanderbilt, professor of business strategy. Is that correct, Professor?
That's right. That's right. I teach MBA students primarily. I've been teaching at Vanderbilt for about 35 years and teach corporate strategy for environment, social governance issues. So the whole spectrum of topics, the social topics related to business strategy.
Well, I really appreciate you being here. So when you saw this in the news, you saw that, shortly after all that happened there at the Capitol, there were some businesses that were saying we are going to cut off political contributions to Republican lawmakers who said that they wanted to overturn the election. What did you think when you saw that?
Well, it is an immediate reaction. I think there was clearly moral outrage on the part of large segment of the public. And I think what you're seeing there is primarily individual business leaders taking their own moral position. I don't think it's as much a business-related issue, which is kind of surprising to hear that. But I mean, there are reasons why they may feel that customers or shareholders care about these kinds of issues, and they do individually. But I think what we're seeing is just a reaction to their own moral political outrage, as much as anything else.
Do you think it is something that will last for any period of time, or do you think it was something based on kind of the shock of that moment, and they will quickly move on and get back to business as usual?
Well, it's hard to predict, but I think this particular issue will probably go away in the sense that we're talking about a small number of legislators, campaign contributions going to a small number of individuals. And look, most businesses who give money to political action committees or to election campaigns are doing it usually for lobbying purposes. They want access to individual congressmen or senators or legislators. They may want to support individuals who will help them on legislation that's favorable to their industry or business. And so I don't think campaign contributions are going away. And the idea of boycotting or not giving to certain individuals, I think this is largely a one-off. I mean, there's lots of other social issues going on in terms of campaign contributions. But, by and large, I don't think you're going to see a mass of companies saying we're going to pick and choose which people we give money to based on these kinds of issues. It's much more what's going to help them or hurt them in the bottom line.
That's right. They usually make decisions based on the bottom line. And often I have seen that some of these companies, they want access, like you said. It's for lobbying purposes and that kind of thing. And they very openly give to both parties and hope to have access as a result. If they were to cut off the spigot to one, or to one group that did something that they didn't agree with, and in this case they're saying voting to overturn the election, that would be flexing their power. But it would also be, I guess, taking a political stance potentially, if this were to go forward, that might be harmful to a business. And so that's why I do wonder, how unusual is this, that they would just say, all after one big event, we're going to cut it off to this group, because it's a partisan group. It was only one group that said we're going to cut it off to this group. How unusual is it? And again, I just wonder, can it last?
Well, I think it is really unusual. We certainly see companies taking political stands that are popular with one segment of society and not popular with another. I mean, gun control or what have you. I mean, even today, I read in today's news that Regions Bank has decided that they're not going to do business with Core Civic, who of course has private prisons. But I mean, there's lots of other banks that will finance Core Civic or do business with Core Civic. So they're doing it for a reason. I don't know why they're doing it, but so you see these one-off kinds of things. But I think here, this is, let's be honest, we're talking about a small percentage, and it's largely a fringe of the political party that took this stand. If this had been a majority, I don't think we'd have seen this, right? If you had 50 or 45 congressmen or senators saying, we should overturn this election, I don't think we would have seen the same thing. Of course, we would have seen other issues as well, more social turmoil.
That's interesting. And I'm looking at some articles here, and one headline is How CEOs Became the Fourth Branch of Government. What do you think of that? I mean, do you think that's where we are? What do you think of that?
Well, there's a little truth to that. I mean, if you step back and you ask yourself, what's the role of a corporation in society? And now you're talking pretty much of large corporations. We can talk about others, but when you start to think about the role of government in regulating business, for a long time we had social pressures that would lead to government actions, legislation, rules, and things like that. And then we saw, for many years, we've seen gridlock. And so when in Congress and in legislators, and so a lot of times when you see these social pressures, they're now getting placed on businesses. So you see boycotts of businesses, or you see nonprofit organizations lobbying businesses. And so a lot of what we're seeing now is in many cases, businesses are taking the place of what used to be legislative action. Now it's a lot more difficult because there's competition. You may have one firm going one way. One firm may focus on climate change reductions and of carbon, and another firm might pollute. So it's not the same thing as having a uniform law. But you do see this where companies have an awful lot more power. Of course, they have a larger size. The scope of everything has gotten bigger through globalization and the media internet age, where you have the ability of firms like Amazon and Facebook to be so large. So in many ways, they do take on that role of both responding to social demands, but also having the impact that government has with their actions. I mean, when a company that has 500,000 employees or has 10 million or 50 million customers does something, that has a huge impact.
And so are we at a moment that is uncomfortable or unprecedented or dangerous in some way? Could they have too much power, or is this perfectly, safe, fine, whatever, in your opinion? I mean, there's some who would say, boy, I hate to see them kind of making these decisions, but there are others who say they need to step up and kind of do these things. I guess where do you stand?
Well, look, I think there's an ideal world, and then there's the reality, and so if you take something like the recent social justice movement after George Floyd, and we've seen a lot of action by corporations, we don't see an awful lot of action by government. And so a lot of what we're seeing is response to these kinds of social concerns, and it is a little bit messier than the government stepping in. But I do think that in some ways it's healthy because given the situation, and if we had a functioning government with two sides saying, okay, we're going to come to compromise and we're going to do this or that, but when you don't have that situation, I think the role of businesses is it's really quite important. And we're seeing companies that are taking stands and doing things for social justice, investing. One example I know, I remember this Netflix said we're going to take 15% of our cash and move it to black-owned businesses. Well, nobody told them they had to do that. And it didn't really cost them much to do that, but they're doing it to try to help spur historically disadvantaged businesses. And that's the kind of thing that, do you really want government mandating that? Well, a lot of people would say no. But is it a positive thing? Yes, it probably is a positive thing. And so we are seeing, in some cases, a very positive role of business in this world.
I can see that. Yeah, that's a great example. And in the example of cutting off contributions to Republicans who wanted to overturn the election, I'm reading something here that says American capitalism is based on a foundation of legal contracts, all of which ultimately rely on strength and stability of government. I mean, they need a stable government to maintain their business. And so in that sense, I guess it is in their best interest to not want things overthrown.
Well, that's right. And in fact, one of the interesting things you see over the last few years is probably the largest pressure for climate change legislation in the U.S. over the last few years has actually come from large businesses. Because they see long-term the importance of getting climate change under control, and they've actually been lobbying government to try to do something because they want consistent standards, and they look at their long-term profitability as being damaged if the climate continues to change. So that's an example of where business has gotten together and said, look, we actually want some uniform standards. We want, now that not every business is doing that, but they're very large corporations that have gotten together and said, we want climate legislation, for example, carbon tax or cap and trade that would help get emissions under control. And these are major corporations. And
okay, so yeah, you're a professor of business strategy and you've watched these trends, and businesses are acting in their own best interest, right? I mean, there's certainly when a company like Netflix says we're going to donate a certain amount to this charity or to this, they're also promoting that, and they're doing it, they want people to see they're doing good, and as a result, there would be benefits to that. And so do you see this as being kind of if there's gridlock in Washington, could businesses really kind of be a major driver of change that maybe they haven't been in the past? Do you see what I'm getting at? Is that where we're heading now?
Well, I think it is, and maybe this is a transitional stage because ultimately government may then pick up on some of the things that businesses are doing. You think about it as kind of the federalism that we have, and why was federalism set up with 50 states? Well, partly so that we can experiment, so that different states can experiment and see what works, and other states may adopt it, and eventually the federal government may adopt it if it's that important. In some ways, it's the same kind of thing. You have, this is a free market with competition, and you have different companies will experiment with different policies, and some of them may be, I want to be a niche marketer to environmental consumers. Some of it may be I care about LGBT community because maybe I have a lot of employees or customers, and I think that might help me in the long term. It may be partly for moral reasons, and that's fine. But I think in a competitive market, what you're going to see is that firms that adopt these policies are largely doing them for. And I'm not being skeptical about this. I think it's appropriate. They're doing it in response to various stakeholder demands, whether it's customers or shareholders. In some cases, we've seen, long-term pension funds demanding companies to reduce their carbon emissions. These aren't customers in some cases. So various stakeholders that are putting pressure on companies, and so firms are responding in different ways depending on where they are in the market.
What did you think about when Twitter and Facebook took President Trump off? There were people that were very concerned about that, very upset about that. There were people that thought it was long overdue. What was kind of your view of that from your position.
It was really interesting, and of course we've seen also with Facebook. What was the name of that social app that they banned?
What was that? Parler, the conservative one, or
Parler? Yeah. Thank you. Right, conservative. Right, Parler. But it's interesting. Let me start with again thinking that if this is a competitive market and there's lots of competitors to Facebook, they should feel free to do that, and because of whatever reasons, because maybe their customer base or whatever their employees care about it, they're telling them they should be doing this. I think that's fine. Again, if I was an ethicist, which I'm not, I mean, you might say there's a moral reason for doing it, and business should be doing it. But look, let's just step back and say, from a business perspective, we can understand where they may want to do that, and Facebook was being pressured for allowing hate speech. Facebook is being pressured for allowing all kinds of bad speech, and I think rightfully so. They're being pressured. Then, the question really is what happens when they, and by the way, it was a lot of companies were dumping Facebook ads. There were companies that were refusing to even advertise on Facebook. So there are these kinds of very interesting pressures going on. I mean, I do think that one of the interesting byproducts, Facebook, and they have the same problem perhaps with Amazon, is becoming more and more like a monopoly. And so that's one of the concerns. When you have, in a free market, it's fine. We have if Facebook doesn't allow this type of advertising or this kind of speech, somebody else might. And so, and that's partly what's happening with Parler. I think they went off on their own and they're trying to establish. I don't know whether they're going to make it on their own and that sort of thing. But when you have a monopoly, that's kind of when you need some more regulation, because they in some sense they have full control over the airwaves or over in social media. And I don't think they have a 100% monopoly, but that's the concern with some of those companies. It's a really interesting case. I mean, it's hard to knock them for throwing hate speech out, at least in my view.
That is fascinating, and that's kind of the discussion that's going to be going forward. Are they a monopoly? Again, professor of business strategy, what should they be thinking? They're close to being a monopoly. It's almost in their best interest not to be a monopoly. I mean, what do you do if you're Facebook right now? Like you said, there was this speech on there. They were getting hammered from all sides. They made a decision. They're getting hammered from all sides again. What do you do?
Well, I'm not going to advise Mark Zuckerberg on what to do. He's in a tough situation. Let's be honest about monopolies. They don't generally last forever unless they have some scarce resource. Nobody else can duplicate or replicate. And Facebook could be gone tomorrow because of a leap of technology, or just social desire for an alternative. There's nothing. Yes, there are barriers to entry. I mean, it takes a lot of money, a lot of capital to do away with something like Facebook and bypass it. But it's, in this day and age, it's possible. So it's hard to say we have a monopoly in the long term for a company like that. The other thing is, let's be honest, it's really hard for them to filter through. Very sympathetic, all of the hate speech, all of the stuff that goes on Facebook. They do monitor it. I know there's lots of flaws in what they do, but they spend an awful lot of money trying to monitor and keep off pedophilia and hate speech and all kinds of things. So no matter what they do, they're going to get criticized for it because it's not a perfect screen filter.
Let's all right, we've kind of set the table here, but let's take a call, then we'll go to a break and encourage everybody to call in. Looks like we have Jimmy here. Hello, Jimmy.
Yes.
Go right ahead.
How are you?
Doing well. Thanks for calling in.
What I was going to say is, like you said, Facebook, Twitter, and them, they almost got a monopoly, right? What happens to the First Amendment, freedom of speech? If there's a social networking system that has a monopoly, then they're controlling thought. If they are taking away people's voices, whether or not it's good, bad, or whatever, should totally be against the law, according to the Constitution.
based on freedom of speech. They shouldn't cut off these people's right to.
No, not that they hold a monopoly. That's like saying we hold a monopoly on everybody out there. We got 90% people listening to us. So therefore, we can control their thoughts. You got to have an open mind, you got to have open thoughts, and you got to have freedom of speech.
Okay. All right. Well, let's ask about that. That is an argument we've certainly heard. So I appreciate Jimmy for calling in. What's the response to that?
Yeah, and it's a good point. First of all, freedom of speech really just applies to the government. So, a privately held company or publicly held company, Facebook, can decide who they want to do business with. They can decide legally it's not an issue, but the more fundamental question is what's appropriate. And look, I want to start with the presumption that it's a monopoly. Yes, it has a lot of market power, but I don't know that it's true to think. Do you think the media has a monopoly? Look at all of the various views you get on one political side versus another. And if Facebook wants to start cutting away from a significant portion of people's content and what they're saying, those people will move, and they will move to another platform. Now the question is Facebook too powerful? I'm actually not an antitrust expert, and I really don't study Facebook to know that much. But they don't have that much market power. They certainly have market power. But when you see that advertisers can move, and you see that Twitter, TikTok, I don't even know. I'm not a social media user, so I would be careful about all this. Some of these are owned by the same companies, and I really don't follow that closely. But just a few years ago, Instagram, some of these companies, they pop up all of a sudden, they become a huge hit, and millions of people subscribe. So I'm not sure they're really a monopoly. I'm not saying I'm not concerned. I am.
Right. Yeah, I see where you're coming from. I also see where Jimmy's coming from. They're close to a monopoly, but you're right. They could lose it overnight, and it is private, and they can be penalized. People can choose to just kind of walk away.
Step in for a second. Right, Ben. If they're a monopoly, I've gotten on Facebook a half dozen times. I have an account because I had some old college friends get on and me some photos. I'm not a Facebook user. And yet I have all kinds of access to information, and I read all kinds of news and social media things. And so I don't think it's true that they're really a monopoly. Interesting.
Okay, very, very good. All right, we are going to take a break. Michael is on the line. Stay on the line, Michael. Others who want to call in, there's the number, 615-737-PLUS, 615-737-7587. Take a break. Be back right after this.